couldn't turn this one down. I know I've done at least 3 on Jeff Sessions, but there was a lot of information on this one, so I just felt like it required me to at least provide this information out there to you guys regarding Jeff Sessions.
Democrats are gearing up for a fight next Tuesday when Attorney General nominee Jeff Sessions becomes the first of Trump's cabinet picks to take the confirmation hearing's hot seat. But the resistance to Sessions has already begun. On Tuesday, 6 protesters from the NAACP were arrested after staging a sit-in at Sessions' office in Mobile, Alabama. The same day, former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick sent a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee recommending against Sessions' nomination as AG. Back in 1985, as a member of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Patrick helped defend 3 black voting rights activists who Sessions was prosecuting on voter fraud charges during his time as a U.S. attorney. Patrick writes in his letter, "To use prosecutorial discretion to attempt to criminalize voter assistance is wrong and should be disqualifying for any aspirant to the nation's highest law enforcement post." And joining me now, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, President of the North Carolina NAACP, and Sherilyn Ifill, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thank you so much. You are just the 2 people that I would dream of talking about on this topic. And may I start? I'm going to start with you, Cheryl, because I have to say, when the list came out of the people who will be testifying, Democrats only get 4 people. They get 2 days, 4 people to testify about Jeff Sessions at this confirmation hearing. I was quite disappointed that your name wasn't on it. You do have Michael Mukasey on the other side, I'm sure, David Cole, legal director of ACLU, Larry Thompson, former U.S. Deputy Attorney General, Cornell Brooks, the president and CEO of the NAACP, someone named Chuck Canterbury, who's the head of the National Fraternal Police. You have a former Dreamer and U.S. veteran, and you have the commissioner of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and then you have founders of 2 civic organizations, Mirror Memoirs and DNA Saves. Were you asked to testify, Sherilyn? And if you had the opportunity to testify, give us a short version of what you would say.
Well, let me start with the short version of what I would say, but preface it by saying I think that both Cornell Brooks, the president of the NAACP, who you talked about at the top of the segment, who was arrested the other day and who is a civil rights attorney himself, and David Cole, the legal director of the ACLU, will do an excellent job laying out the legal issues and the history of Senator Sessions as it relates to civil rights law. So I think that we are in good hands. To be honest, I'm more concerned about local voices being heard, that is African-American Alabamans. I had hoped that maybe there would be someone from Alabama who is familiar with Senator Sessions who would be on the list, but there's not. I think it's very obvious what has to be said and what probably will be said, which is that the question before this committee is whether or not Senator Sessions' record in public life of nearly 40 years, probably more than 40 years, demonstrates that he is fit and prepared and qualified to be the chief law enforcement officer of the United States and, for our purposes, to be the chief enforcer of the nation's civil rights laws. And Senator Sessions' record suggests, in fact, quite the opposite. You alluded to the Perry 3 prosecution in 1985. These were 3 black voting activists represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. 2 of them, Albert and Evelyn Turner, were very close lieutenants of Martin Luther King, and they were prosecuted by Senator Sessions when he was U.S. attorney. They were acquitted, but this has not been forgotten, and in fact, that case and other statements made by the senator was one of the reasons why in 1986 the Senate Judiciary Committee would not move him forward when he sought to be a federal district judge. And so the question then is, what has happened since then in Senator Sessions' record? And when you look at that record does not look like a man who turned away from that awful history and who became a civil rights champion. Instead, that history reflects someone who voted against the Violence Against Women Act, someone who voted against the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act, someone who resisted the effort to place African-American judges on the federal bench. Someone who, as we know from this year, has supported a presidential candidate who has engaged in conversations about Muslims, about Mexican Americans, who suggested that a Mexican American judge, a judge of Mexican American descent, could not be impartial in his case. Many of you may remember Senator Sessions saying similar things when Justice Sotomayor was at her confirmation hearings to sit on the Supreme Court. So if you look at that record over the course of 40 years, Congress then has to answer that question. The Senate Judiciary Committee has to answer the question. What in this man's record suggests over 40 years that he should be entrusted with being the chief enforcer of the nation's civil rights laws?
Yeah, absolutely. I highly recommend people read Deval Patrick's letter. He would have also been a great person to put on that panel. Would have loved to see him testify. Highly recommend people read it. It's chilling. Reverend Dr. Barber, what concerns you most? The history includes Sessions having prosecuted members of the NAACP in Alabama for attempting to help register people to vote. Is it voting rights that concerns you most about his record, or something else?
Well, that's so fundamental, Joy, to this democracy, and I was so glad to see the NAACP and our president standing up with our President Simonton in Alabama and others. But on Monday, interfaith clergy, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sikhs, we're doing a moral action, repairers of the breach in faith and public policy in Washington, D.C., and then in the Senate building. Because Jeff Sessions, when you look at his past and his present, is quite problematic when it comes to the issue of civil rights. In his past, he tried to put civil rights activists who were fighting for voting rights in jail for 250 years. That's the same length of time when we were in slavery in this country. In his present, he has supported the Shelby decision, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. He has been a part of upholding, fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 1,200 days since June 25, 2013. He has spoken against the Voting Rights Act at the very time that courts all over the country and in the South, where I'm from in North Carolina, federal courts are ruling over and over again that these legislators, without pre-clearance, are engaging in the worst kind of voter suppression that we have seen since the days of Jim Crow. We had 800 or more less voting sites in 2016 election. Hundreds of thousands of votes were suppressed across this country. So Jeff Sessions has a racist political ideology. Now, they're trying to say it's just political ideology, but he has a political ideology that is race-driven. He is like James Crow Esquire, and to put him over the Justice Department would be like putting the fox over the chicken house. The leper, as one lady said from Alabama, has not changed his spots. Now, after saying that, his policies on immigration, the way he thinks about immigrants, his policies on religious freedom, his close ties that we've seen with white supremacists, this is problematic. And for those of us in states like North Carolina, that are battling extremism every day and an attempt to roll back voting rights, the last thing we need is a hostile U.S. Attorney General who is hostile to the Constitution and hostile to protecting the very mandates of that office.
Yeah, I want to play this for our audience who maybe not been around at that time or weren't paying attention to it. Ted Kennedy, back in 1986, at the confirmation hearings where Jeff Sessions was not approved to be a federal judge. I just want you to just hear him just for a moment. This is the late Ted Kennedy talking about Jeff Sessions.
Mr. Sessions is a throwback to a shameful era, which I know both black and white Americans thought was in our past. It's inconceivable to me that a person of this attitude is qualified to be a U.S. attorney, let alone a United States federal judge. He is, I believe, a disgrace to the Justice Department, and he should withdraw his nomination and resign his position.
You can see a young Joe Biden sitting there next to him. I want to now fast forward to an excerpt from a letter that law school professors wrote just recently, and this is detailing their concerns, their ongoing concerns. Some of us have concerns about his misguided prosecution of 3 civil rights activists for voter fraud in Alabama in 1985, and his consistent promotion of the myth of voter impersonation fraud, about his support for building a wall along our country's southern border, his robust support for robust drug policies that have fueled mass incarceration, his questioning of the relationship between fossil fuels and climate change, his repeated opposition to legislative efforts to promote the rights of women and minorities and of the LGBT community. And Sherilyn, I would add to that, when I talk to young activists who are affiliated with Black Lives Matter, the question of what would happen if they were to recreate what we saw in the 1960s, where young people like John Lewis at the time went out and protested, and even if they were beaten by the local sheriff, they could call upon the Justice Department to come in and essentially be the cavalry. How concerned are you as a litigator, as a civil rights lawyer, that there will be no cavalry if Jeff Sessions is the head of the Justice Department?
Joy, I'm so glad you raised this, because I think every American needs to be concerned about that. You know, we may take for granted what it meant to have an Eric Holder fly down to Ferguson and be able to shake hands with individuals in the coffee shop and sit down with parents and families, what it meant for Loretta Lynch to fly to Baltimore and to be able to sit around the table with community leaders and reassure them of the Justice Department's engagement with the issue of police-involved violence. When we don't have that, we are going to see something quite different. And this is why I think this, of all the cabinet positions for African Americans, is the most important one. The Department of Justice and the Attorney General has control over so many of the elements of the criminal justice system that affect our lives, over the Federal Bureau of Prisons, over immigration judges, over the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Everything that we have been talking about and concerned with around policing reform, the pattern and practice investigations in Baltimore, the investigation that's ongoing in Chicago, what we learned from Ferguson, all of that falls under the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
And this is a nominee who has said in the past that he doesn't believe in consent decrees. He thinks consent decrees are an end run around the democratic process. Well, the Department of Justice is a party to consent decrees in dozens of desegregation cases throughout the South. I know this because we're co-counsel with them in many of those cases. It's the Department of Justice that negotiates the consent decree in a pattern and practice case after the police department has been investigated. Is he going to be committed to using the power of the Department of Justice to continue to do that? Is he going to abide by the obligations of the consent decrees in desegregation cases that bind the Department of Justice and Southern school districts? These are all critically important questions that we have to have the answers to, and we can't pretend that just because he's a senator that they know him, that there should be, you know, comedy and friendship. This is about a professional investigation of someone who seeks to have the keys to one of the most important pillars of our democracy, the rule of law.
Yeah, and last point to you, Reverend Barber, then you as an activist who risks arrest every Monday as part of the Moral Mondays Forward Together movement in North Carolina, what should activists do in the event that he is elected? What should activists do?
Well, the reason clergy are stepping up and why we're going as clergy into the Senate, into the heart of this issue, is because Trump ought to pull the name, Senator Sessions ought to pull his name out, and the Senate ought to reject his name. We're talking about a man who is anti the basic principles of the Constitution, being hired to be the enforcer of the Constitution. Now, the first step, you know, Joanne, towards mass civil disobedience is you first always deliver your grievance, and you attempt to have your adversary do the right thing. If not, then you're prepared to do mass civil disobedience and whatever else is necessary. We believe that this is wrong. He might have the politics of racism, but he does not have the politics that should be a part of the American democracy process at the highest law enforcement officer in this country. It is wrong, and we have to stand against it with our deepest moral values and use every nonviolent moral tool to do it. And if he does somehow become appointed, we should be prepared to stand against his actions every day, because they would be wrong for America and they would take us backwards rather than forward.
Yeah, well, Reverend Dr. William Barber and Sherilyn Ifill, my friends, I regret that we will be talking about this, I think, a lot over the these next 4 years, but let's see what happens. Maybe the power of moral persuasion will convince the Trump administration to think differently. Thank you.
I doubt it seriously. Okay, friends, please, if you wouldn't mind, like the video, subscribe if you choose to, and hit that bell to be notified of new videos that I'm going to put up. My channel's not monetized at this point, and I'm kind of thinking about it, but haven't made a decision yet. The reason that I'm just thinking about it and haven't made a decision is because I kind of like to actually post the actual video feeds from the various places that I take videos from instead of just putting a picture up and letting the sound go. So we'll see. You know, I got to make a decision on that. But, you know, again, please like, subscribe, and share the video. I think this is important information that we all need to be aware of.